I'm Lyndsey Smith with Real Agriculture, and perhaps for the first time ever, we are going to have a lamb market discussion. You're welcome, everybody. All right, joining me is Angus Gidley-Baird. He's the animal protein analyst for Rabobank, based out of Sydney, Australia. Angus, has the lamb market in Australia, we spoke about the cattle market and how it ebbs and flows with grass. Was the lamb market as impacted by the droughts in the past 10 years?
Yes, it has been. It's probably you probably don't see it to the same extent as cattle, just because of the shorter gestation period and period, I suppose, reproductive cycle from a sheep and the twinning capabilities. We definitely see it in our sheep slaughter numbers. Like we have years where it's dry and massive offloading of sheep, and some of that is sort of reflective of the wool industry that might be running wethers out there, and the first thing that goes when the season turns bad is wethers, and then you sort of start working your way through. So we see it more in our sheep numbers. Lamb numbers don't tend to go up and down as much. They are volatile, but not as much because of that ability to, I suppose, get back into the system pretty quickly, and the lambing rates and twinning rates and things like that allow you to sort of return to volume reasonably quickly.
And so where does Australia sit right now as far as sheep numbers?
Well, it's hard. It depends how far back in history you look with Australia and sheep numbers, because if you go back sort of 30, 40 plus years, then we've got huge sheep numbers, but it was all based around wool. Our sheep numbers now are sitting around, I think they're sort of 65 to 70 odd million, although inventory numbers in Australia are a little bit rubbery. But that's been relatively stable for the last 10 years. The interesting thing, though, is we've seen lamb production continue to edge up over that time, even though the sheep inventory hasn't changed much. And that's a change in the composition of that flock, as those sort of traditional merino producers look at the wool check that they get from selling wool and make a decision whether or not they want to still be in fine wool production, or whether they go into a first cross and a prime lamb production business. So we've actually seen sheep numbers relatively stable, but lamb production continue to increase.
Mm-hmm. And for anyone who's been in a Canadian grocery store, you'll probably know where our Australian lamb ends up. But what are your major markets for Australian lamb?
Yeah, we're still big domestic consumers. It's gradually, when I say gradually shifting, our domestic consumer isn't necessarily increasing their consumption, so it's relatively flat, and therefore all growth is effectively into an export market. But we're exporting about 60% of our production, so slightly more than half goes into an export market. The Middle East is our biggest market, and then at the moment US would be second and China's third.
And what are prices doing? What does the price outlook look like for lamb?
Yeah, prices at the moment are reasonable. Actually, I think our Australian market prices are probably a little bit high, but this is an interesting thing looking at our current flock at the moment, where it sits in our production levels. But we had a similar situation to our cattle herd in that 2018-19 was very dry. We saw a lot of sheep sold during that process. We've rebuilt the sheep flock. Obviously, the numbers come back online a lot quicker, so we reached that record production level very quickly. In 2023, when the whole world sort of went a little bit quiet on increasing inflation and costs, we found, particularly for lamb, where it tends to go through a lot more food service outlets. It's a big domestic consumption in Australia, and we buy a lot from the supermarket, but elsewhere it's sort of through a food service is a main channel. And when people start cutting back costs, that's one of the areas that we find it. So we actually saw in 2023, plus with forecast dry conditions, we saw a big drop in our lamb prices. They dropped down to, I can't remember what the prices were now, but they probably got down to a sort of $4 or thereabouts, less than $4 Australian a kilo. They're now back up around high sevens to $8 a kilo, but nowhere near the highs of the 9 to 10s that we saw back in 2022. So they're back at reasonable levels, and everyone's generally comfortable where they are at the moment.
So then I would imagine, grass levels obviously matter, but with a strong export market, what about things like logistics costs, etc.? What do those look like for the year ahead?
Yeah, they're always a big question mark. It's okay at the moment, but we do keep an eye on things like freight rates and availability of containers. The other unfortunate thing of being stuck right down the bottom of the earth is you're not on one of those major trade routes. So things like what goes on in the Middle East and disruptions over there, anything that happens in terms of containers being stuck in certain areas, like what we saw through COVID when there seemed to be a lot of containers stuck in the China area. It does make shipping and getting that product out a lot harder. But our processors and exporters in Australia, that's just part of how they work, and they've got to manage that as a challenge.
All right, Angus, thank you so much.
Not a problem.